They once earned more in a single week than most Americans made in a year. Millions passed through their hands. Studio contracts, sold-out theaters, names carved into Hollywood history. At the height of their careers, security seemed guaranteed, but when the work stopped, the money disappeared faster than the applause. Some died with less than a few $1,000s to their name. Others left behind unpaid tax bills, empty apartments, or a single room far from the city that made them famous. At ages when most people plan retirement, they were still performing just to survive. This is not about scandal or failure. It is about distance. The distance between fame and protection, between recognition and stability. Tonight, we remember 10 lives whose final numbers reveal a quieter, harder truth about Hollywood. Let's begin. On the night she died, there were no studio calls to return, no contracts waiting to be signed. Barbara Payton spent her final days in a modest home, far removed from the world that once photographed her relentlessly. At 39, an age when most people are still building forward, her life had already narrowed to survival, illness, and isolation. Only a decade earlier, Hollywood had introduced her as a rising star. Her screen presence was striking, and early roles placed her alongside established names of the era. For a brief moment, the industry treated her as an investment. But the protection ended quickly. Personal instability, substance dependence, and public scandals made her difficult to insure, then difficult to cast. As roles disappeared, income followed. Arrests and hospitalizations replaced premieres. Without consistent work or financial guidance, her resources evaporated. By her late 30s, she was living in poverty, relying on short-term arrangements and informal support to get through each week. In ordinary terms, 39 is not an ending. It is a midpoint, a time when mistakes can still be corrected. For Payton, the margin for recovery had already closed. Years of untreated addiction and physical decline left her body unable to sustain itself. When she died from heart and liver failure, there were no industry statements, no memorials, and no meaningful estate to speak of. Her cremation was arranged quietly, without ceremony. Hollywood did not erase her, it simply moved on. And in that silence, her story became less about scandal and more about how quickly visibility disappears once a performer no longer fits the system's needs. For a generation of moviegoers, Errol Flynn did not simply star in adventure films. He defined them. His performances in swashbuckling classics reshaped how Hollywood portrayed heroism, movement, and masculine charm. Studios relied on him to carry large productions, and audiences associated his face with energy, confidence, and escape. At a time when cinema was still forming its visual language, Flynn became one of its most recognizable symbols. His success was not brief or accidental. It was structural, built into the identity of Golden Age Hollywood itself. What followed that success, however, was not stability. Flynn lived as if momentum alone could replace planning. Wealth moved through his life quickly, spent on property, travel, legal battles, and personal excess. Multiple marriages and public controversies drained his resources, while health problems quietly reduced his ability to work at the pace the industry expected. As tastes shifted and younger stars emerged, the roles he once dominated grew smaller and less reliable. By the late stages of his career, the steady studio support that had once protected him no longer existed. When he died at 50, his estate amounted to roughly $10,000, an almost symbolic figure compared to the scale of his earlier earnings. In ordinary circumstances, 50 marks authority and experience. For Flynn, it marked fatigue. He continued accepting work not to expand his legacy, but to maintain relevance long enough to survive. His decline was not sudden, nor was it dramatic. It unfolded quietly, shaped by an industry that rewarded intensity but offered little structure. Once that intensity became unsustainable, Hollywood preserved his image as an icon of adventure. What it did not preserve was the man behind it. His films remained vibrant and alive. His final years were neither, serving as a reminder that cultural impact and personal security were never the same thing. There was a time when Judy Garland's name alone could carry an entire production. Studios built schedules around her availability. Concert halls sold out before posters even finished printing. The money came steadily, in amounts that, by today's standards, would equal tens of millions of dollars. To audiences, her success did not look temporary. It looked settled, permanent, almost guaranteed. But the structure behind her fame was fragile. Years of studio control, chemical dependency disguised as medical care, and constant performance demands quietly eroded both her health and finances. Management missteps and repeated tax problems followed her for years. By the end of her life, her estate was valued at roughly $40,000, while outstanding debts and tax obligations had climbed into the millions. In her final months, she was no longer headlining grand stages. She was singing night after night in small London clubs, relying on modest appearance fees to cover hotel bills, medical costs, and basic living expenses. The applause remained, but the protection was gone. For most people, 47 marks a period of consolidation, a time when savings exist and work becomes a choice. For Garland, there was no pause. Her final days were spent moving between rented spaces, managing exhaustion, and preparing for the next performance simply to stay afloat. When she died alone in a bathroom far from home, the world mourned an icon. Hollywood released statements. Fans revisited old films. But the numbers told a quieter truth. Fame preserved her image, not her well-being. Her ending was not sudden or mysterious. It was the slow result of a system that celebrated her output while offering little shelter once her strength was spent. Dorothy Dandridge occupies a permanent place in Hollywood history, even for audiences who may not remember her films in detail. In the mid-20th century, she became the first African-American woman nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress, a milestone that quietly reshaped the industry's boundaries. Her presence challenged the narrow roles available to performers of color, and her performances carried a level of elegance and emotional control that critics could not dismiss. For a brief moment, her success suggested that the system itself might finally be shifting. But historical significance did not translate into security. Despite her visibility, the roles offered to Dandridge remained limited, inconsistent, and often financially unstable. Studio opportunities arrived sporadically, and many projects that could have sustained her career never materialized. Poor financial guidance, combined with heavy tax obligations, steadily eroded what she earned. By the early 1960s, she had declared bankruptcy, owing approximately $150,000 in back taxes. The pressure was not only economic. Isolation, professional frustration, and failed relationships compounded the strain, leaving her increasingly cut off from the industry she had helped change. For most people, early 40s represent momentum and experience. For Dandridge, they marked exhaustion. She lived alone in a modest apartment, far removed from the image that once symbolized progress and promise. When she was found dead at 42, the official cause was an accidental overdose, and her bank account reportedly held just a few cents. Hollywood acknowledged her importance only after the fact. Her legacy endured in history books and award statistics, but her life ended without the protection her achievements deserved. She opened a door that others would later walk through, yet she herself was never allowed to step fully inside. When Marie Prevost was found dead in her apartment, there was no crowd outside, no press waiting, just a small, poorly lit room, unpaid bills, and the silence of neighbors who had not seen her in days. She was 38 years old. In ordinary life, that age suggests continuity. In her case, it marked an ending that went largely unnoticed. A decade earlier, Prevost had been one of the most recognizable faces of the silent film era. Her performances carried warmth, timing, and a natural charm that directors relied on heavily throughout the 1920s. She appeared in major productions and worked with some of the most respected filmmakers of her time. For several years, she was consistently employed, well-paid, and firmly embedded in Hollywood's rising star system. Her success was not marginal. It was visible, documented, and widely admired. The transition to sound films changed everything. Prevost struggled to adapt to an industry that now demanded a different kind of presence. Roles became scarce, then disappeared entirely. Without steady work, her income collapsed. Financial support systems were minimal, and there was no mechanism to retrain or reposition performers who fell out of favor. As opportunities dried up, isolation set in. Alcohol became both escape and routine. By the mid-1930s, she was living alone, dependent on occasional assistance, her career already treated as a closed chapter by the industry that had once depended on her reliability. For most people, 38 still allows room to rebuild. For Prevost, there was no bridge back. Malnutrition and chronic alcoholism weakened her body beyond recovery. When she died, she reportedly left behind only a few $100s. No studio statements followed. No public reassessment came in time to matter. Her films survived in archives, while her life concluded quietly in a space far removed from premieres and applause. Prevost's story is not about sudden tragedy. It is about how quickly usefulness defined value, and how little remained once that usefulness ended. The collapse came fast, and it came in public. In 1921, Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle went from being one of the most powerful figures in silent cinema to a name studios refused to print. Headlines replaced film posters. Courtrooms replaced sets. Before the trials even concluded, his career was already considered expendable. Hollywood did not wait for clarity. It moved to protect itself. That reaction erased the scale of what Arbuckle had built. At his height, he was among the highest-paid entertainers in the world, earning amounts that exceeded $1 million a year, an extraordinary figure for the era. His physical comedy shaped early film language, influencing performers who would later become legends themselves. Arbuckle was not a novelty. He was infrastructure. Studios trusted him to deliver hits. Audiences trusted him to deliver laughter. But after a series of highly publicized trials, despite his eventual acquittal, his films were pulled from circulation and his name became commercially toxic. The financial damage was immediate and irreversible. Legal fees consumed most of what he had earned, with estimates reaching hundreds of thousands of dollars. Work disappeared overnight. In an attempt to survive professionally, he directed films under a pseudonym, separating his labor from his identity. The strategy allowed limited income, but no return to prominence. Health problems followed, compounded by stress and isolation. By the time Arbuckle died at 46, his wealth was gone, and his reputation remained suspended in unresolved suspicion rather than restored truth. For most people, acquittal signals recovery. For Arbuckle, it changed nothing. Hollywood did not reinstate him, it simply replaced him. His legacy survived indirectly through the comedians he influenced and the techniques he pioneered, while his own life concluded quietly and diminished. His story is not just about scandal, it is about how quickly an industry can erase someone once they become inconvenient, regardless of what the facts eventually say. $7 million. That was the amount Sammy Davis Jr. still owed in unpaid taxes as his life was drawing to a close. For an entertainer who had spent decades at the center of American pop culture, the number felt jarring. He had earned far more than that across a lifetime of relentless work. Yet the ledger told a colder story, one where fame and income failed to cancel out consequence. Davis was not simply successful, he was foundational. As a core member of the Rat Pack, he helped define an era built on charisma, excess, and non-stop performance. He moved effortlessly between music, film, television, and live stage, commanding attention wherever he stood. Beyond entertainment, his presence carried social weight. He crossed racial barriers in spaces that had long resisted change, often absorbing pressure quietly while continuing to perform. But behind the scenes, financial discipline never matched his output. Lavish spending, gambling losses, poor financial advice, and years of deferred tax payments accumulated slowly, hidden beneath applause and demand. As illness entered the picture, those hidden numbers became unavoidable. Medical costs rose, energy declined. Yet Davis continued performing, not to extend his legacy, but to buy time. Time to negotiate with the Internal Revenue Service. Time to sell off homes, cars, and personal possessions. Time to outrun a debt that refused to shrink. When he died at 64, his estate remained millions of dollars in the red, leaving obligations rather than security behind. A career like his should have created distance from worry, not dependence on it. Instead, his final years were shaped by motion without relief. Perform, pay, repeat. The industry praised his resilience, but offered no framework for sustainability once constant movement became the only way forward. When he died, the applause stopped instantly, and the numbers remained. His recordings endured. His cultural impact was secure. What vanished was the illusion that success alone was ever enough. Sammy Davis Jr. left behind a legacy admired across generations and a financial reality that revealed how little protection even the most visible careers could provide once the momentum finally broke. By the time people began asking what had happened to Veronica Lake, she had already slipped out of Hollywood's memory. The name that once dominated marquees and magazine covers was no longer attached to premieres or contracts. There were no announcements marking her absence, no formal goodbye. She simply stopped being part of the conversation, replaced quietly by newer faces and shifting tastes. At her height, Lake had been one of the most recognizable women in American cinema. Her distinctive hairstyle became a cultural phenomenon, copied across the country and instantly associated with sophistication and mystery. On screen, she projected a cool, controlled presence that set her apart in the 1940s, appearing in major studio productions and working alongside leading actors of the era. Studios marketed her image carefully, and audiences responded. For a time, her visibility felt permanent, embedded in the visual language of classic Hollywood. That permanence proved fragile. Professional conflicts, declining mental health, and a growing dependence on alcohol strained her reliability in an industry that valued control above all else. As roles diminished, income followed. By the early 1950s, she had declared bankruptcy, an early warning of how quickly her situation was deteriorating. Without consistent work or institutional support, she drifted away from the system that had once amplified her image. In later years, reports surfaced of her working low-wage service jobs, far removed from the elegance audiences still associated with her face. The contrast was stark. A woman whose image once shaped fashion trends now lived largely unseen. When Lake died at 50, her passing registered quietly, acknowledged more as a curiosity than a loss. Hollywood preserved the silhouette, the hairstyle, the idea. It did not preserve the person. Her story is not defined by scandal or a single collapse, but by gradual erasure. Visibility gave her recognition, but it did not guarantee care. In the end, Veronica Lake remained famous in photographs, while her life concluded without the protection that fame so convincingly promised. Parkinson's disease advances without drama. It takes control quietly, first from the hands, then from speech, then from independence itself. For Terry Thomas, the illness ended more than a career. It removed the physical precision his work depended on and replaced it with medical routines, constant supervision, and mounting expenses. As treatment continued year after year, the cost of care climbed into the tens of thousands of pounds annually, a figure that quickly overwhelmed what remained of his savings once work was no longer possible. There was a time when Terry Thomas represented the height of British comic sophistication. His exaggerated mannerisms, razor-sharp timing, and unmistakable gap-toothed grin made him instantly recognizable to audiences across Europe and beyond. Films such as Those Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines showcased a style of humor built on control, rhythm, and restraint. He was not a background performer. He carried productions, commanded attention, and earned accordingly. Success felt stable, as if consistency itself might be enough to guarantee a secure future. Illness dismantled that assumption completely. As Parkinson's worsened, employment vanished and income stopped, while care costs accelerated. Properties were sold, personal belongings followed. Support eventually came not from studios or contracts, but from colleagues who organized a benefit to cover basic needs. His final years were spent in a modest retirement home for actors, dependent on assistance rather than earnings. When Terry Thomas died at 78, respect remained, but resources did not. His films survived intact, still capable of producing laughter on demand. His private life ended without that same continuity. What his story exposes is not excess or mismanagement, but vulnerability. A career built entirely on physical mastery offers no protection once the body fails, and talent alone cannot compensate when the system has no structure for what comes after. For many audiences, Harry Langdon existed as a memory frozen in black and white, a childlike face, slow reactions, a style of comedy that felt gentle even when the industry around him grew louder and faster. His image survived long after his relevance faded, creating the illusion that his career had remained intact. In reality, the distance between that image and his final years was vast. During the silent film era, Langdon stood among the most successful comedians in Hollywood. His films rivaled those of Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton at the box office, and studios treated him as a major asset. At his peak, he earned enormous sums for the time and enjoyed creative control. Few performers were granted. His unique screen persona shaped early cinematic comedy, relying on timing, vulnerability, and restraint rather than spectacle. For a brief period, Langdon was not an alternative. He was essential. That position did not survive the transition to sound, nor the internal decisions that followed. Creative missteps, poor management, and declining audience interest quickly eroded his standing. As contracts disappeared, so did income. Langdon spent years moving between short-term work and uncredited writing jobs, unable to regain the momentum that once defined him. By the time of his death at 66, his finances were largely depleted, leaving little beyond residual recognition and personal effects. What remains of Langdon's story is quiet and unresolved. A performer once central to the language of film comedy ended his life without the stability his influence suggested he deserved. His work continued to be studied, referenced, and preserved, while his personal circumstances were allowed to fade unnoticed. The system remembered what he gave it. It did not remember to protect him once his usefulness passed. In that gap between legacy and livelihood, Harry Langdon's life reached its final frame. As the years passed and the spotlight naturally shifted elsewhere, what remained was not failure, but time. Time that continued quietly, long after the crowds thinned out. These lives did not end in headlines. They unfolded in ordinary rooms, ordinary years, and ordinary struggles that fame was never meant to erase. Hollywood remembers performances easily, smiles preserved on film, voices that never age. But it rarely remembers the people once the work slows down, the bodies that grow tired, the finances that thin out, the long stretch of life after relevance gently passes. These 10 stories are not warnings. They are reflections of talent that mattered, of moments that shaped culture, and of human beings who gave more than the system ever returned. Perhaps the question is not how brightly they once shined. It is how gently they were allowed to fade. If these stories meant something to you, take a moment to stay with us. Subscribe for more quiet reflections on Hollywood's forgotten lives, and share which story you'll be thinking about long after this ends.